Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and thank you so very much for joining me this evening. I do hope you're doing incredibly well, and don't forget to get that lovely hot cup of cocoa because you're going to need it, because I've got a lovely story for you tonight. Lots and lots of love to each and every one of you. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Hugh and I'm from Alberta in Western Canada, where the exquisite landscape here encompasses mountains, prairies, desert badlands and coniferous forests. My family is from Lethbridge, which has a very small town feel about it, as people are very congenial and friendly in this part of the world. But there is the added convenience of close access to all the local amenities that you can find when you're in an urban metropolis, from restaurants, coffee shops and schools. The climate in Lethbridge consists of pleasant warm summers and mild winters due to its close proximity to the Canadian Rockies. Growing up, we lived in the southern part of town, in the Cooley Creek neighbourhood, in a ranch-style home, in a rectangular U-shaped house, with whitewashed walls, low-pitched grey roofs, with wide eaves and a large patio area, which is quite commonplace. I grew up here with both my loving, attentive parents and older sister Letitia, and I can honestly say we really did have an idyllic childhood, with so much outdoor spaces where we could explore, camp and hike, as there was an abundance of recreational activities to enjoy and appreciate, so we were never short of interesting things to do as a family. My bizarre, curious story begins when I was going on a field camp with about 19 other boys in my year at school with our biology teacher, Mr. Anderson, and I was incredibly excited. I was about 11 years old at the time, which was in 1996. Mr. Anderson was the most beloved teacher in our entire school. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that everybody loved him, and even the parents thought he was an incredibly cool dude. He was quirky and eccentric, with a great sense of humour. At school he transformed every single biology lesson into a work of art, and made our studies become so alive that every boy in the class would hang on to his every word, as if it was the gospel. We listened to him speak with such passion and unbridled enthusiasm of the natural world, which was so contagious that every boy in our class, irrespective of their academic prowess, always ended up getting excellent grades. Mr. Anderson was one of those exceptional teachers and made no apologies for his unconventional teaching style. And even the headmaster of our school confessed that if there were indeed more teachers like Mr. Anderson around, there would be absolutely no failed pupils. Mr. Anderson was in his early 60s and was strong, well-built, athletic and very nimble. He was a good-looking gentleman and was one of those people that actually improved with age, much like a good wine. He had silvery hair and bright hazel eyes. He told me once he'd never been married because in his younger days he would jet-set all over the globe on intrepid, exciting adventures. He didn't want to be tied down with a family and kids at that stage of his life. Whilst all his friends were getting married and raising families, Mr. Anderson was climbing mountains, exploring rainforests, visiting remote villages and indigenous people, and some of the stories he shared with us about his exciting adventures were quite simply mind-blowing. Mr. Anderson regularly organised about 3 field trips a year with his classes. They weren't compulsory, of course, but every boy in our class would never turn down a camping trip with Mr. Anderson. You'd have to be mad to do so, because invariably you'd be missing out on one hell of an adventure. So there we were, out in the idyllic natural world, camping with Mr. Anderson, our all-time favourite teacher. We pitched 6 4-man tents, one specifically for Mr. Anderson to occupy, while every other tent was inhabited by 4 boys per tent. We prepared a large fire pit and placed a couple of loose tree limbs around the area for seating purposes, and they were very comfortable indeed. Our campsite overlooked a ravishing aquamarine lake, which gets its exquisite turquoise colour from the retraction of rock flour that flows into the lake during the summer months, so very typical of lakes here in the Rockies, most especially the famous Lake Louise, which is indeed something spectacular to behold. The glistening lake that surrounded our campsite looked like a sparkling, glittering sapphire, reflecting all the panoramic views of the mountains, the clouds, glaciers and trees upon its gleaming surface like a shimmering mirror. This precious jewel was set against a panoramic backdrop of of the most majestic silhouettes of tall, imposing mountains with such rugged, interesting triangular ridges that in themselves were like great works of sculpture. Then there were the tall, alpine, verdant trees that were dotted together in sumptuous carpets of green. Our camp overlooked the lake and was surrounded on either side by an undulating prairie filled with green turf and pretty spring flowers. And on the rear of our campsite were forests of trees that stretched back for many miles, with hiking trails literally everywhere. We couldn't have asked to be in a more sublime, idyllic and tranquil place, and it's so easy to be completely mesmerised by these incredible views. On the first day of our trip, Mr. Anderson gave us each our own glass bottle and asked us to collect a living insect so we could discuss what it was that we'd actually found. And so off we went to search for our insects, teaming up with one other person on our search. My partner was Matt, who was my very best friend in school, so it was naturally reasonable that we would team up together. Matt collected a lady beetle, and I found the most exquisite butterfly and placed it in a screw-cap bottle with air holes and a few flowers to sit on. Before long we were discussing all the insects in detail, from bugs to grasshoppers and centipedes. "Why did you choose a butterfly, Hugh?" Mr. Anderson asked me. "Well, sir," I said, "I think they're rather beautiful. I like the fact that they actually metamorphosize. They go from being a caterpillar that is limited in its movements to a period of time spent in a cocoon, only to emerge from their confinement totally transformed. I like that, sir. I like the fact that the butterfly can fly over great distances, and they're free. If I were an insect, sir, I would definitely choose to be a butterfly." "Well put," said Mr. Anderson. "I couldn't have put it better myself. What about you, Matty? Why did you choose a lady beetle?" "Well, sir," said Matt, looking very, very serious, "ladybugs are very, very lucky. One day my mother found a ladybug on her handbag, and later in the day, sir, she came into some very good news about a sizable inheritance that she hadn't been expecting to receive from an aunt of hers. She didn't believe the aunt even liked her. Another time, sir, there was a ladybug on our car, and my mother ran through a red light, and the officer let her off with a warning, and she didn't have to pay a fine. So they are very lucky, sir. I also like the red colour and the black dots. I think they're also pretty." "Well, that's very interesting, Matt. I did like your definition." So after everybody had discussed the insects that they had caught in great detail, as usual it would seem that Mr. Anderson's rather quirky, outlandish and eccentric way of teaching had us all riveted and inspired. After we finished our discussions at great length, we finally set our insects free and then went for a long hike. We returned to camp to cook and prepare our meat over the fire pit. By this time we were famished. We watched in awe as the sun set over the valley, buttering it in tangerines, orange and golds, and after the soft orange contours ebbed and faded away, a mellow dusky darkness veiled our campsite, welcoming in the night, and before long the vast firmament was dotted with twinkling stars and a bright ivory moon, and we could hear the sounds of croaking frogs and singing crickets serenading the night with their soulful chatter. "It's a full moon," said Mr. Anderson, pointing towards the sky. "Did you know that people can be much more intense and very emotional during a full moon?" "No, sir," I said. "I didn't know that." "Oh, it's a scientific fact," reflected Mr. Anderson. "Even the hospitals know about it. There are many more emergencies on a full moon." Before long we were seated by a crackling fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. "Who has a good ghost story for us?" asked Mr. Anderson. "We have to have a good story around the fire, as it's a prerequisite for a good camp." "I have, sir," said a young boy called Robbie. "Well, in a manner of speaking, I have." "Go on," said Mr. Anderson. "We're all waiting attentively." "Well, sir, my mother told me this story," he said. "It's a true story, sir. She was driving home in blizzard conditions, and it was very cold, and everything was carpeted in thick snow. The wind was panelling against my mother's window violently and beating against her car incredibly hard. All of a sudden she saw this young woman who was wearing a soft gown in these treacherous Arctic icy conditions, walking on her own in the snow. My mother was mortified to see this poor woman wearing a summery dress in these freezing weather conditions. My mother stopped her car immediately and offered the woman a lift. She said it was very odd because the woman was not even shivering with cold. She didn't even appear to be freezing. My mother said that the woman had a radiance about her, something that was really quite strange. She said it wasn't of this world, and began to talk to her in a musical voice, telling her all kinds of things about her life that she couldn't possibly have known. She told my mother to have a lot of courage because everything would be fine in the end. You see, my mother had breast cancer at the time, sir, and no one knew about her condition, but now she's fine, with no sign of cancer anymore. But she said the car suddenly started to skid violently, sir. It lost traction. It should have rolled over the rocky ridge, but it didn't. And even though it didn't have guardrails at the time, it should have rolled over. But it actually just bounced back on its wheels and was back in the middle of the road as if nothing had happened, sir. She turned around to say to the woman, "Did you see that?" Because she knew what had just happened, but when she turned around, sir, the woman had just vanished, disappeared from her sight. She looked around, but the woman was nowhere to be seen, sir. My mother believes that it was an angel that protected her from having a very serious accident that could ultimately have killed her. She was certain about that, sir. "A wonderful story, Matt," said Mr. Anderson. "I do believe in angels. I believe that they can intervene in our lives, especially when they need to rescue us from perilous conditions, when it's not our time to leave the earth plane, that is." "Do you think our time is determined, Mr. Anderson?" I asked. "Oh, I do, son," he said. "I really do. But I could be wrong, of course." "Anyone else with a story?" he asked, "especially a ghost story." "Well, mine's a ghost story, sir, but it's not as nice as hers," said another boy called Cole. "My older sister Frederica is completely nuts, sir. She's so fascinated about ghosts. She actually frequents all those haunted places that you hear about, sir, and she regularly visits graveyards." "I can't say I blame her. I love graveyards," said Mr. Anderson. "I enjoy looking at those old gravestones from bygone days. I love reading the names on the graves and when the person died. It fascinates me for some bizarre reason." "Exactly like my sister, sir. She could spend hours in a graveyard and never get bored. One day she was meeting two of her friends in the graveyard. Other people meet in coffee shops, sir, but never my sister nor her friends. They like to chat around the graves, and they smoke cigarettes and drink swigs of cream brandy, which they pass around to each other while they chat and giggle and laugh. My mother thinks it's very inappropriate, distasteful and disrespectful, but my sister doesn't care. She says it's all a free world and she can do what she likes. She's nonconformist, sir, and very opinionated about absolutely everything." "I know what you mean," laughed Mr. Anderson. "A free spirit, that's what your sister is. And there's nothing wrong with being individualistic and unique. It makes the world a much more interesting place. It most certainly does. Go on with your story, Cole. We're all listening." "Well, one day my sister got to the graveyard early. She saw this dark female figure floating above the grave and then merging into it and disappearing. She said it was the most sinister, evil-looking thing that she'd ever seen in her life, sir. This happened in broad daylight, not at night, so it freaked my sister out. But she waited for her friends to tell them what she'd seen. But they all wanted to stay at the graveyard in the hope that they'd see it too, because they thought it would be so exciting to observe. But the ghostly spectre never actually reappeared. But it doesn't end there, sir, because when my sister came home, my mother even noticed that the house seemed darker and heavier, almost oppressive if you like. Everyone felt it for an entire week, and even my father, who never notices anything, commented that something was really off at home. Everyone in the house felt uneasy and certain that they were being watched by unseen eyes, but we never saw anything. One night our entire household was awoken to my sister screaming, and we raced into her bedroom. I've never been so scared, sir, as I was certain someone had broken into our house and was trying to murder my sister. My frantic father was trembling as he loaded his rifle, and we all rushed into her room. Sir, I've never seen my sister so frightened in all my life. Her face had grown an ashen white colour, and there were red claw marks around her neck, as if something evil had been attacking her violently, like a savage mountain lion or something with claws. My father asked her what the heck had happened. She told us that this evil, insidious woman from the graveyard that she'd seen the week prior had been hovering above her and trying to strangle her to death. She said she tried to fight the demonical entity back, but was completely powerless to do so. It was as if her body froze over like a block of ice. We all believed her because our house had become so menacing in the past few days after her macabre encounter. The long and the short of it, sir, was that the house was cleansed and blessed, and the medium who visited our home told us that my sister had brought that demonical entity back from the graveyard. Oh, it was the most awful thing, sir. She said that the entity was very, very dangerous and could potentially have killed my sister. Now that is a ghost story, Cole, of note, said Mr. Anderson, looking rather impressed. Did you manage to eliminate the spirit from your home, may I ask you? Oh, yes, sir, we did. The heaviness in our house lifted, and everybody felt it immediately, sir. It was incredible. Needless to say, my sister never went back to that Pacific graveyard, but she still visits other graveyards, which my mother's not best pleased about. And who can blame her? Reflected Mr. Anderson. Thank you for that very interesting story, Cole. I think we all enjoyed it, said Mr. Anderson. But now it's beddy byes. Everybody groaned. Can't we stay up a little longer, Mr. Anderson? Absolutely not, he chided. We have another exciting day ahead of us in the morning. I want you to team up with your partners again and look for something in nature of interest to you that we can discuss, and it can be anything from a rock to a flower. In the twinkling of an eye, we were all sinking into our sleeping bags, and our minds were drifting off to the world of dreams, and the next morning we awoke to the smell of bacon and eggs filling our campsite. Mr. Anderson had prepared us a sumptuous feast, and was cooking for 20 hungry boys, which is no mean feat, let me assure you. But as usual, he excelled himself. We piled our plates with lots of bacon and scrambled eggs, beans and mushrooms, which we washed down with fresh orange juice. Now off with you, said Mr. Anderson, handing us each bottles of water. Do not wander off too far from the camp, and bring back something very interesting, will you? There's a lot out there, so no excuses. Matty and I decided to walk to the further edge of the prairie, while the other kids were taking walking trails up the higher elevations. I could tell that the prairie stretched back quite a way, and I liked the open space. The wild flowers and the pretty butterflies darting from one flower to another really intrigued me, so I decided that this was the way we should go. Let's go this way, I urged Matty. Should we not have taken the hiking trail, said Matt, like the others? What are we going to actually find on a prairie? Lots, I should imagine, I said. What exactly are we looking for, asked Matt. Anything we find remotely interesting from nature, like a flower or a pine cone. Anything that intrigues us in some way. It can't be that hard, surely. Matty and I began scanning our surroundings as we meandered through the long grass. All of a sudden I tripped over a rock that was lying submerged beneath the undergrowth, and I let out an agonizing cry as I went flying along the grass and falling on my side, where I could tell that I'd seriously broken or sprained my ankle. I tried to get up, but the pain was excruciating, and I could feel that my ankle was throbbing and pounding, and even when I got up, I could barely walk. What the heck did you do? Asked Mac, looking rather vexed. I tripped, I told him. The grass was so long I failed to see the rock jutting up in the ground. Not to worry, he reassured me kindly, lifting up my right arm and guiding me gently with one hand, where I hobbled towards an old tree trunk. You sit over there, he said. I'll go and find Mr. Anderson, but I might be quite a while, so hang in there tight. He might have gone up the trail with the others. I nodded as I watched my friend retreating from whence we'd come and resigned myself for a bit of a long wait, but I sat back to enjoy the perfect view and watch the pretty prairie butterflies darting from one delicate spring flower to the next. It was an exquisitely beautiful day, and I could hear the sounds of tweets and warbles across the valley. The soft shafts of sunlight lit up the areas of the prairie in a gentle, resplendent light, and there was a soft breeze blowing that caused the prairie flowers to sway to the right like tiny dancers. Suddenly everything became very quiet for a moment, as if a moment in time had been but frozen like a picture on your television set that you pause for a moment. In the twinkling of an eye I detected this very weird, rather peculiar smell, and the only way I can describe it to you is that someone had not had a bath for a considerably long period of time and was rather sweaty and niffy. I then heard the sound of heavy feet moving across the prairie, and then I saw him. I had no idea what he was, but I knew at once that this was no bear. As I sat on the edge of the prairie, under a tree, I was nonplussed and bedazzled by what I was observing. So much so, in fact, that for a moment I never even considered my own vulnerability, or the very possibility that I could be in very grave danger. If I was seen by this apex predator, I was in no doubt that I would be. My fear was suspended by total intrigue and fascination as I contemplated what on earth this extraordinary creature actually was. Could I have just observed an unidentified species not yet discovered by science, I wondered? Even if indeed this was the case, I highly doubted that anyone would ever believe such a seemingly incongruous, erroneous story, as witnessing this peculiar critter in our reality seemed preposterous enough. The colossal, Herculean-sized creature engendered the primate qualities of the great ape, but also the humanoid influences of a man, and both those characteristics were clearly ingrained in its biological makeup. It was covered in long flowing dark hair, with overlong arms and very powerful legs, with a ripped muscular V-shaped torso, with gargantuan-sized shoulders that merged into a streamlined waist. The head was rather like a dome that sat directly on top of his shoulders like a boiled egg in an egg cup, for I did not behold any visible neck. The critter was easily 7 foot tall, 500 to 600 pounds and 3 foot wide, and was lofty, powerful, strong, majestic, and exceedingly graceful. In total horror and disbelief, I beheld this awesome beast gliding towards me, swinging his arms backwards and forwards as though he was marching, and he moved so seamlessly and flawlessly with large 5-foot strides. In that second I became so fearful, and my heart began to pound violently in my chest, and my breathing intensified rapidly. How could I escape this creature? I could barely move myself, and my ankle was aching. It was too late, because he was now standing only yards away from me, and judging by his bewildered, befuddled expression, he was as surprised to see me, as indeed I was to see him. He stopped still for a moment and just gawked at me through his dark treacle eyes that seemed curious and inquisitive. It was almost as if he was perturbed as to why I was sitting on my own in this vast prairie. He looked at me as if he was scanning my very soul. I felt as if he could read my thoughts and my mind, and that was very unsettling and discomposing. "Please don't hurt me," I kept begging in my heart. "Please, please, please don't hurt me." I just sat there under the tree, eyeballing this creature, and it felt like time stood still, as if the clock of our world had decided to keep the hand on one point for a little longer. The moments that unfolded before me were so surreal, as the creature just locked his gaze with mine, and I struggled to look away. It was that intense. To my amazement, the creature then turned away and began to move past me, gliding through the wooded area where he moved through the trees with such a flawless grace. How can something that size, that balances on 2 legs, move his body with the ease of a ballerina and the dexterity of a gymnast? It defied rational explanation. I knew where he was, as he was climbing up the mountainous ravine, because every time he moved, the trees would sway with his body. I breathed a huge sigh of relief when he was gone from my sight. Oh my God, what did I just see? On reflection, now that I look back all these years later, this critter didn't actually display any form of aggression towards me. To cut a long story short, I was evacuated to hospital, where it was ascertained that I'd only just sprained my ankle, but the doctor assured me that sprains can sometimes feel more painful than breaks. I did tell my best friend Matt what I'd seen, but I could tell by the expression on his face that he thought I'd really seen something else like a bear, and he didn't really believe me. All these years later, I know what I saw, and it was a Bigfoot. So there you are. That's my story. What an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.